This is uncomfortable pause while we wait. There we go. Well, hey everyone, welcome to our August 30th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Community Meeting. I almost forgot the name of the meeting. I think I'm tired. We have a lot to go over in this meeting, as we do in all of our meetings. If you're new, I think that you're in for a treat. If you're interested in a range of some of the base assumptions about what scientific governance and what financial risk modeling is all about, all the way up to, or all the way down to, I suppose, some lower level mechanisms in how we manage acquiring new collateral types and just understanding finance in general. So there's a lot to absorb. I'm not going to ramble for too much longer then. So I'm going to hand it off to Stephen Becker. Stephen, if you want to introduce yourself and then maybe give us an overview of what the agenda is for today.
Okay, well, my name is Stephen Becker. I'm currently heading up the risk function, as well as being the president and COO of MakerDAO. Excuse me. So for today, what I would like to cover is to first recap everything that we've sort of learned in terms of risk up to this point. Then what we touched on previously was liquidation ratio. I wish to actually complete that because I didn't really get to the liquidity components of the liquidation ratio. And then move on to looking at the correlation risk, which is obviously clearly tied to holding concentrated positions and trying to figure out how to manage those. And then finally, we can actually have a look at the price feed risk, and if time permits, the economic capital and stability fee, which I'm sure will also attract quite a bit of attention. So to probably change things up a little bit and not hear me just go on a monologue for the next 5 to 10 minutes. Rich, are there any questions that we've held over from previous calls? Are there any new questions that folks want to start off with?
Well, I'm going to be selfish, and I'm going to ask you a question that's been on my mind for a couple of weeks now, because I think that you mentioned this 2 meetings ago, and I've been trying to wrap my head around it. And correct me if maybe I'm misquoting you here, but you mentioned at one point that defaults in this system are sort of a sign of a healthy economy, and I'm trying to understand whether I understand those implications or not. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, you are, and that is pretty much correct. There is, in the natural economy, in the traditional economy, there's something called the natural rate of unemployment. Now, if you think about it, it kind of sounds weird. Folks have to be unemployed to a certain level to basically give you a sense that the economy is working appropriately. There's a natural level to it. Now, the same kind of notion applies to defaults as well. You should have a natural rate of default, because if you don't, then you're not living in a normal environment where you are exposed to distributions that change. If you don't have these defaults, and if they're not at least regular to a certain extent, that basically means you have not considered the distribution appropriately of the collateral that you're working with, or you've estimated the risks. This is not a terrible thing. It's not the end of the world, but what it does is it really makes your business suboptimal. The one aspect that I would like to touch on later today is the correlation risk. And the correlation risk when building a portfolio has to take into consideration business, as well as the integrity and stability of the system. If you don't consider the business, then you could quite easily just be overbearing from the risk point of view and have the whole thing overarching. You could have liquidation ratios of like 300%. But the point being is then you wouldn't get the business. So there's that balance that you need. And that balance requires a certain amount of default. And the reason that you need that default as well is that you need an appropriate distribution of keepers. You need an appropriate distribution of stakeholders that are waiting to be able to find their business incentives in purchasing collateral, and then finding their liquidity trajectories into the market and how they will realize that collateral into potential returns. So those defaults give incentive. Those incentive creates a broader population of participants, and that broader population of participants actually adds to the safeguarding of the overall system. So the whole thing relates quite nicely.
So yeah, that's interesting. I think that it's partly my own issues with wrapping my head around the whole concept of risk being a thing that exists, that's kind of measurable and sort of like a pressure valve that needs to be released, or one group needs to adopt it. And so is that kind of how it loops back? If the MakerDAO ecosystem is a combination of basically two groups, stability seekers and risk seekers. And without default, then we don't have risk. Is that too simplistic a way of putting it, or is that accurate?
No, that's pretty accurate. I mean, the act of default isn't an earth-shattering event. The act of default is an opportunity. The act of complete default over all collateral types, that is an earth-shattering event. A complete black swan for ETH that basically gets all CDPs bitten, that is a cataclysmic event. But the general nature of things is that there is a stochastic or random behavior, and you have to allow for it. You can manage it to a certain extent, but certain things are going to happen beyond that extent. And they're going to be natural, just very rare. And in those instances, you need to have folks that can step in and be able to compensate for that risk. If you try to mitigate all the risk, if you have no risk, you have no return, you have no business.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that clears up some things for me. I think I'm probably going to have to stew on that and then hit you up again next week for some
No,
more.
by all means. There's one thing that folks, it's very interesting, especially from the investment banking position. You know, you don't talk about the returns that you make. You talk about the risk that you're taking. You know, when you trade options, it's not about the option price. It's about the volatility, because the volatility is the price.
Yeah, and I think that's partially where I have some difficulty, because I'm definitely a neophyte when it comes to economics in general. So I'm playing catch up here, and I think there's definitely a lot of truth to what you just said that I'm kind of wrapping my head around. All right, that's interesting. We do have two questions from last week. Good questions, and I'm hoping that I still understand the context. Right before we had to shut down the meeting, Jordan Crandall asked, will there be caps on individual CDP sizes or individual CDPs?
The short answer is no. The correct answer is there should be.
Interesting. What does that mean?
Well, it's very difficult to do it, but each set of risk parameters should be bespoke to each CDP, because it depends on the amount that you actually put in. If you think about it very clearly, you know, the one aspect that we're trying
to... Sorry, Stephen, I think you're cutting out a bit too much.
Okay, let me see. I don't know what else to do. How am I now? Can you see me?
Slightly better, yeah.
It's very weird. I mean, I'm right next to the router. Okay, well, I'll carry on. And if I do cut out a little bit more, just tell me to repeat myself. But
sure. If it gets really bad, I think turning off video for a while might help, but I think it's fine now.
Okay. Okay, so where was I? I was talking about the CDPs. Yes, so that was the question. Your liquidation ratio and your risk profiles are very much dependent on the liquidity that is available to you in the market. And that liquidity and the impact of that liquidity is dependent on the size that you take. In other words, the more collateral that you submit, if that collateral in a CDP gets bitten, the amount that you actually have to try and liquidate into the market might, if the position is big enough, impact the market. So each CDP could have a potential cap with respect to its own liquidity profile. But because we can't do that, we need to take an aggregate across all possibilities and then represent that aggregate as the sort of de facto point that's going to represent, you know, the broader space for that collateral type. And then consequently, we'll have the necessary debt ceilings, the necessary liquidation ratios that captures the majority of that profile. There are going to be instances that the profile is not going to capture extreme events, and that's why natural defaults are also acceptable, because you cannot possibly account for everything, because if you do, you'll go down to a granular level where you're mitigating absolutely everything. And that's not only intractable because of the number of parameters that you're working with, the permutations will just explode, but also with respect to just the business opportunity, you'll obviously kill that as well. Does that make sense? I've frozen. Okay, can you guys hear me now?
I can.
Okay, super. I wonder where Rich.
Yeah, I gotta say, I've been hearing you fine this whole time. So.
Oh, okay. No, I think, yes, I think.
Hey, sorry everybody, I'm back.
Okay, so
I think the secret was that it was my connection that was really bad.
yeah, I think it is.
Sorry, everyone. I
I'm
fixed it.
Okay, cool. Let's stick myself back on then. There we go.
Too many VPNs all at once. All right.
Okay, so I think we got the whole concept of the CDP, and in the fact that you don't want to put a limit per CDP, but you do want to put a limit per collateral type that is represented as a distribution through the potential uses of those CDPs.
Okay, I missed most of your answer, but I'm gonna assume it was stellar. So I think we'll move on to the next question.
It was brilliant. You have no idea.
I'll take your word for it. I'll watch it in the replay and find out whether you're lying to me. Okay, David Utro had a question at the end of the meeting, last meeting, and I'm wondering whether I've captured the context or whether I remember the context. He says, doesn't this require monitoring liquidity closely on every asset we support in the DAI credit system? So I believe he was referring back to the liquidation ratio that we were talking about.
Yes, basically every single collateral type that you add, you have to, constantly monitor.
Yeah, and I think that I might have had a question too, or at least I think I know where he was going, because I've been trying to figure out exactly what kind of effort, or is the risk team's job to sort of daily or even hourly monitor the health of an asset class?
Theoretically, continuously.
Okay, so that makes a lot more sense to me then. So
you can imagine a dashboard that has, well, in the traditional world, you have a dashboard that has the live prices coming in, the live volumes coming in, the transformations on the data, create the metrics for yourself, and the metrics are compared against your mandated numbers. And if you've got any breaches of those numbers, you get flags, and then those flags initiate procedures. That's the basic format of a risk management diagnostic tool.
Yeah, I don't know if we should go too far into the weeds on this, but maybe we'll go a few feet. So a risk team is watching their dashboards, or they have a monitoring or an alerting setup devised, and they see that, I don't know, silver is something bad's happening to silver, or some particular crypto asset class is behaving poorly. Bad tweet went out, and then things are going to get very risky very soon. What would be the next step? Is it an emergency proposal gets released, or
from our point of view, that has to be some seriously material change in the profile of an asset. If that is the case, then yes, an emergency proposal will be given. But in general, it will be a case of changing something in the next executive vote that will happen in the next quarter. The reason being is that risk management specifically is about looking at, well, in this context, is about looking at information over a given period to be applied to a given period, generally a much shorter period. And you might have things happening during that period that are a little bit off scale, but it's not that specific event that should arouse an issue with you. It should be a sequence of those events that will put the full sort of risk management construct right out of whack. So you generally don't want to have knee-jerk reactions when it comes to risk management, because that generally leads to the demise of things. You have to make sure that the model that you have in place and the time period to which you apply it needs to be consistent. Because if you start messing around with the time period, then you're not really applying yourself to the given mandate of what that risk purpose was.
Yeah, so I imagine that the risk teams are a fairly sober group of people that are not going to react.
But there's
So-
something completely tragic, like all of a sudden, let's say we're using 0x as collateral, and for some reason 0x collateral sorry, 0x volume is 0 on a specific day. It's just 0 for 24 hours. That is a big concern. That's when people need to go into action. You might find that it's the volume has gone to 0 because of a glitch. Phew, thank goodness we can carry on. No, 0x has actually gone to the volume has gone to 0 because of an issue. Well, that changes the whole landscape. Something needs to be done about it now. But generally, if something really bad is about to happen, it does first transition slowly, and then there's an inflection point. And you've got to.
Sorry, one of the things that I've been trying to wrap my head around as well is that let's imagine we have 3 distributed risk teams, or 30, it doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
What is their primary focus? Where do their allegiances lie? Is it with the particular asset classes that they've evaluated and put proposals forward for our ecosystem, or is it the health of the portfolio, collateral portfolio as a whole?
Well, their incentives are pretty much aligned with their singular purposes that they have. So let me explain that. If you do have 3 risk teams, well, that's okay. It's cool. Nice to start off with more than one. But ultimately, those incentives can be driven by MKR token holders. As an activist investor, you want to make sure that you have a firm idea on the risk side of things. And this is a very unique situation where you create a risk team that does the assessments, but may have a specific bias towards profiles that the MKR token holders that created those risk teams want to see. You may also have risk teams that are just employed by specific collateral types, just to make sure that their collateral is put forward. There's a lot of ways that you can get representation, but it's got to be represented clearly. You can't manufacture that token ABC is wonderful. The debt ceiling should be $1 billion, because if there isn't the underlying empirical data to not only vet the fact that this has happened, but the calculations from it have to show that those are the numbers that make sense.
So ultimately, the group of stakeholders that are incentivized to monitor and maintain the health of the entire portfolio are the voters themselves. It's not any one particular risk team.
No, there's a number of incentives. It could be the Maker token holders themselves, but then there's also a risk team that could possibly present a greater solution. And in terms of providing a greater solution, they may be compensated appropriately by the system. So it might actually be a simple case of providing a risk service and being paid for that risk service.
Wow, that's interesting. So sort of a meta risk team, kind of.
Pretty much. You can have that, or you can just simply have someone come in and say, listen, I will do all the data cleaning for MakerDAO, as long as the Maker token holders are happy to pay me this amount of money, or this amount of whatever. And it's for governance to look at this proposal and go, really, are you so good at data cleaning that this makes a big difference in the world? The other risk teams might concur. They say this guy's data cleaning is absolutely amazing. You can see that in comparison to what is out there, it is well formatted, it's appropriately placed, it's in a structure that we can access very quickly. There are redundancies in place. Yes, this is wonderful. We should use him. And the Maker token holders will go, fine, this is a great dude. Let's sign him off, and we start incentivizing him to provide that service. So there are many incentives out there for a risk team to be involved. The point of the matter is that there's a critical mass that we require. Once we get past that critical mass, then you don't have any specific biases. Even if the bias is there, you're still protected by the scientific portion of this. You are protected by the fact that you have to have this reproducible research that is well vetted and well presented. You cannot just decide that, gee whiz, I like a particular token and I'm going to treat it favorably. It's got to be proven, and you've got to prove rational, hopefully rational, like-minded people that this is the case.
Okay, great. I think that's enough focusing on my own particular interests. We can get back to one of David's last questions. He wants to, when we were talking about the liquidation ratios, he wanted to understand, how do we factor in the auction mechanism when determining what a liquidation ratio should be?
How do we factor in the auction mechanism?
So we were talking about liquidity. So when we're evaluating an asset class, what we want to understand is how quickly we can get rid of that asset class in a 24-hour period, for example. If the final way that we sort of offload those assets is through an auction mechanism that we've been talking about for multi-collateral DAI, are the auction looking at the liquidity of an asset class in the general market won't necessarily tell us what the liquidity of that asset will be in our local auctions?
No, it won't. The premise of the liquidation ratio is assuming that someone has already bought the collateral. So the actual auction process itself, undergoes its own procedures and has its own processes, which folks will be, aware of or be made aware of. But the risk there is saying, well, once something is bitten, once a CDP is bitten, you want to participate in this collateral, you have to take into consideration the time frame of that auction to resolve itself, as well as the ability for the person who's purchased the collateral to go and actually liquidate this in a manner that they see fit. And if you recall, in this crypto market, the idea of liquidation is different. It's not necessarily taking the asset and turn it into US dollars. You could take that asset and turn it into another token. Generally, the token that you turn it into is theoretically more liquid than the one that you're purchasing from the auction. But there are many different vectors that you can take, and ultimately, it is somewhat included into the liquidation ratio because the ratio takes into cognizance a time period required to try and get rid of collateral. So that time period, you might have a portion of that time period in acquiring the collateral from the auction, and the remaining time period to try and get rid of the actual collateral. Once again, it's a number that tries to represent the whole as opposed to being unique to each circumstance.
Okay, that clears things up for me, I think.
Okay, cool.
For David as well. Andrew had a question in the chat. With global settlements, can global settlement apply to a single asset class, or what we should call it emergency shutdown now, because that's the new name. So in an emergency shutdown situation, will it apply to a single asset class, or is that global across the board?
You could make it local. You could make it local to a specific asset class, but I think you'll find that an emergency shutdown for a specific asset class might be, just unique to the fact that those CDPs all get bitten at the same time. I mean, you pretty much have the thing kind of built in. The emergency shutdown is for the system as a whole. If one asset class all of a sudden liquidity goes to nothing, you pretty much have, the price will go to nothing, all the CDPs will be bitten, and you'll have all that collateral released to be auctioned. So in effect, it's almost like a local emergency shutdown.
I think, but the whole concept, or the official emergency capital shutdown, is that term or that mechanism is sort of reserved for the black swan events, where something is either systemic to the system or a systemic to or existential threat to Ethereum itself, or maybe a global financial meltdown or something. That's when we wind down the entire system, but focused on a specific collateral type. Doesn't that kind of blur the lines between using Maker as a recapitalization resource? So the larger group of Maker holders would become responsible for a specific asset class becoming defaulted. Does that still make sense?
Yeah, it unfortunately does. Because what you're doing is you're saying, it's like you decided to purchase Walmart and stick it into your portfolio, and then tomorrow, for some reason, the SEC decides to close Walmart down. You didn't see it coming. There's no ways you could see it coming, and it came. And as a result, Walmart lost 95% of its value. The chances, you look at it and basically say it's a big blue chip company, the chances of that happening are so remote you can't calculate it. But in the event that it does, you basically have to tally up and go, okay, well, how do we go for this? This is part and parcel of the whole understanding of the risk construct that's inherent in the system. To pretend that it can't happen, that it's impossible, is folly, but you can, this is kind of a little bit more abstract, but you can assign a probability of 0. Because the probability of something having 0 chance of happening still does not make it impossible. It's just that it's not measurable. You don't know how to measure that particular event happening. It's a little bit abstract, but in this instance, this is the case. You're taking on a token, you're looking at its general dynamics, but if something really just cataclysmic happens to it tomorrow, then yes, basically, we're on the hook.
Okay, I think we're at the end of the questions we had saved up from the last meeting.
Okay,
I don't think there's anything new in the chat, so if we wanted to move on to new stuff today.
Yeah, so basically what I wanted to do was just go through the liquidation ratio again. I mean, previously I mentioned that, you know, this ratio is a parameter that controls for the volatility and the liquidity risk. And, you know, we spoke about the volatility component where I posed that question or posed the statement that, you know, given a specific point in time, what is the likelihood of a token dropping by 1% in one day? And if you think about it carefully, it's kind of a sort of a statement with compound aspects to it. I mean, the one thing I did mention is the chance of it falling by 1% over a time period being one day. And what we found from the previous call is that if you reverse that aspect and said, well, how much could you possibly lose over a given day, given a certain probability, you could come up with a percentage figure. That is, in essence, the definition of value at risk. And value at risk is what we apply in calculating the buffer, or that, you know, extra percentage above 100% that we want to add onto the liquidation ratio to make sure that those loans generated from those collateral types are sufficiently protected. But there's an interesting part about this is that, you know, with value at risk, we talk about volatility, and that's all we've been focusing on. You know, what is the volatility of this particular asset? One thing we haven't considered is something called drift. Now, drift is literally just what direction is this token going. You generally find that if something is going wrong, the drift is downward. So shouldn't we take that into consideration? Shouldn't we say, well, if you're going to worry about liquidating a collateral type over 6 or 7 days, shouldn't you worry about its potential move going down over 6 or 7 days collectively with its volatility? And the short answer to that is no, because the assumption there is, regardless of the situation, you are hoping to get out of your position at the most current price level. And you cannot decide that you want to incorporate a drift component. You cannot decide that you want to incorporate a speculative component in that as well to assess what the value is going to be. I bring this up because this is something that you have to be cognizant of it as well, because it is very regime specific. If you're in a bear market and you have a CDP, you've got to be more cognizant of what your risk management is for that CDP. If you're not, you're going to have the underlying volatility biting you, but the underlying volatility in a downward market, which is generally a little bit worse, you know, biting you as well. And over and above that, you've got the drift pushing it down against your position. So it really is a case of saying we can't cater for that because it's impossible, but we can make you aware of it in terms of how you want to look after your CDP when you do open it. That encapsulates the volatility portion of liquidation ratio. But what about the actual liquidity risk? In other words, what are we looking at with respect to liquidity risk? You've got so much collateral and you are given 7 days to get rid of it. So that means, you know, you try and get rid of 1/7 of it every single day. There is a natural liquidity constraint in the market. Firstly, there's a spread you have to cross. And then secondly, there's a natural sort of deviation of movement of bid and ask stacks during the day. You are naturally exposed to that. So consequently, while you're trying to get rid of your position, you need to incorporate those movements over and above the volatility that you have calculated from the market. Because the volatility, this might feel like I'm getting in the weeds a bit, but the volatility is calculated off a daily price. In other words, Most people like to use the closing price, but that price is not necessarily representative of everything that happens during the day. So what happens during the day is a lot of liquidity risk, a lot of liquidity movement, and we have to incorporate that as well. Because if it's severe, you'll see that your liquidation ratio will adjust, appropriately and materially. But if it's not, then your liquidation ratio will be more or less the same as if you just looked at the volatility. So the combination of the volatility component and the liquidity risk component combined together, basically form the risk construct that the liquidation ratio parameter tries to control for. So that, in essence, is what we're trying to achieve with the liquidation ratio. So we've covered qualitative risk, we've covered the debt ceilings beforehand, and now we've also covered the liquidation ratio. The one thing I want to jump into right now is correlation risk. And this is interesting because this, it's not your normal investment portfolio where you do your sort of efficiency frontier calculation of a portfolio and decide that that's the best place you want to create your portfolio and then go ahead and construct it. We don't have this risk-adjusted return on risk-adjusted capital point of view. We're not trying to optimize the absolute details out of this. We need to try and create safety and security in terms of the integrity and the stability of the system, as well as conduct business, as well as actually making this thing work functionally. So the basic tenet of diversification, as everyone will probably know, is that if you have two random variables that are not perfectly correlated and you combine them together, the standard deviation of their combination is actually less than the sum of the individual standard deviations. Now, that is just the basics of portfolio management as well. You have two separate assets, you put them into your portfolio, you will inherently create something called a diversification benefit. The difference between the sum of the individual versus the actual volatility of the portfolio is that diversification benefit. And I've mentioned this in previous calls. In your traditional space, people will try and use that diversification benefit to squeeze out an extra return, because the benefit allows you to increase your exposure to risk because your return profile will be likewise improved. You'll actually generate more return for yourself. But in this situation, for us, and for MakerDAO specifically, the Maker token holders have to consider this collateral portfolio in terms of how you build it up slowly so that you don't have concentration risk, but you also induce the best business that you could possibly have. It's no use going out there and deciding that the only things you want to include are these fantastically uncorrelated assets and only them. Because all you're saying then is that the correlation measure will dictate the actual the business sense of each of those correlation types. For the same reason, we can't go out and just look at the business reasoning for each collateral type. We have to consider its correlation as well. So there's this happy medium that we need to basically understand, and that is what we need to focus on. So we can't construct the collateral portfolio in terms of this correlation risk by just simply combining things together when they happen, when the opportunities arise, because we will create concentration pockets that will be very hard to manage. But at the same time, we need to make sure that this construct is in a lockstep way. If you recall from the debt ceiling community call, I mentioned this sort of defensive ceiling. What that really is just saying we may have a very large debt ceiling for a particular collateral asset, but we're not going to start with that very large debt ceiling. We're going to start with a very small one. And when that debt ceiling gets the entire portfolio appropriately, when certain collateral types are filled away from the rest, because all you're doing is inducing more concentration risk. But at the same time, if there is a preference for a particular collateral type, we should allow it to move a little bit more quickly than the rest of the collateral types in the portfolio. This is something that the Maker token holders will need to get their heads around. There is a safety component, but there's a business component as well. Like, how do you actually go about generating a DAI? You need to consider decent collateral types that are uncorrelated but still make business sense. And if you can sort of wrap your head around that and see how the construct works slowly and in a lockstep fashion, I think you can actually achieve both goals at the same time. So on that front, are there any questions? Or have I stunned everyone into silence? Okay, I can carry on. So that's basically the correlation risk, and that is something that helps us manage the concentrations in the portfolio. And if you combine the correlation risk with the liquidation ratio and the debt ceilings, you start to get a sort of a bigger picture of how all these parameters are working together to manage the portfolio that actually underlies the system. You can also start to see that there are so many fascinating little elements that ultimately pop out, which these parameters, the debt ceiling, liquidation ratio, and then eventually when we talk about the stability fee, all manage to consolidate and diagnose at the same time. It's kind of strange. I always think about the fact that there's so many permutations that can actually happen within a portfolio. How could you just use 2 or 3 tools to make sure this whole thing works appropriately? In the same way, if you have a look at the Federal Reserve, ultimately it has 2 tools: open monetary policy, open market operations in terms of buying and selling assets, and basically an interest rate. That's what they've got, and that seems to work very well for them. But I'm not basically using them as a point of reference. I'm just showing how it's kind of amazing when you have things that are so highly complicated, but effectively you can use very simple tools. As long as you use those tools in conjunction and in a considered way, you can actually control for a heightened level of complexity, and you can actually control for it pretty well. What you cannot do is control for everything. And if you can accept that from the outset, it makes the whole process a lot easier to manage, and it gives you the opportunity to understand where there is business to be had and growth in the not only in the system, but the growth that we can facilitate on the blockchain economy as well. Okay, I think that's enough about correlation risk. So the next one, which is pretty interesting, is price feed risk. Now, something that is really more characteristic of the crypto space than pretty much anywhere else. Strangely enough, around the world, if you have a look at it, if you have a look at their capital markets, most countries have one exchange. So consequently, you have one place where there is price discovery. You have one place where there is an ultimate reference of price and therefore a sense of value for a particular asset. Certain countries have maybe 2 or 3 exchanges. The United States is particularly interesting. It has many. In fact, it probably has one of the most fragmented, actually it has the most fragmented market in the world. But enter crypto, and if you have a look at the crypto space in relation to the United States looks very well organized and not fragmented at all. Now, this induces so many problems, especially with respect to what is the correct representation of price. If you look at ETH as an example, where would you get your source of price from? Would you go to a specific exchange like GDAX or Coinbase, or would you use some sort of consolidation at a point in time? You hope that the arbitrage mechanisms between all these exchanges will induce price discovery to become more specific to the point where you can rely on any exchange's value to be a representative value for that particular token. But unfortunately, that works for the more sort of native blockchain tokens, but it doesn't expand appropriately through all, the whole token space. So there are some aspects where you might find an exchange is more conducive to trading a certain token, even though there's another exchange that has that same token, but there's not a lot of trading going on. Now, you would hope that the arbitrage would make sure that that is sorted out. But even though there is that arbitrage mechanism that helps you sort out the price discovery, you may have frictions between exchanges. You may have on-ramps and off-ramps, or maybe there's actual the inability to formulate a trajectory from one exchange to the other without bearing a significant cost, which makes just arbitrage not feasible at all. So therefore, you have this problem of what does the price actually, what is the price representation for a particular token? Where do you get it from? You need a real source of truth, and you need some sort of consensus around what that source of truth is. And this is extraordinarily important, especially with respect to our collateral portfolio, because the underlying value of that collateral comes from a price feed. And we got to say, well, that price feed we have a lot of confidence in that price feed, and we think that it does represent the value of that collateral type. And the way we go about it is by creating something that is effectively a median transform. We have oracles that, I think we got about 14 or 15 oracles that bring in the appropriate prices, and then what we do is we take the median of those prices. Now, folks may argue that there are better mechanisms for it, but essentially what this does is that a median is better than a mean, because a median does not have any sensitivities to major outliers. If someone is a bad actor, or if someone just has some sort of fat finger problem with respect to an oracle, they could absolutely mess up a mean of an oracle price representation, but a median will be able to ignore it. A median will still stay more or less in the middle of the representation of the distribution, and for all intents and purposes, that is probably the most simplest, the most effective way of representing price and hopefully the respective value of that particular collateral type. The one thing just to emphasize now, I talk about price and I talk about value as two different things. Some people would say, well, isn't the price the value? And the answer is, a big no, it isn't. Price in my world, especially when you have a look at exchanges, those are the sort of advertised prices. It's not necessarily the actual value of the particular asset. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you are holding a great amount of a specific asset and the current price is 100, you know that if you try and sell it right now, you're not going to get 100 for your entire holding. But what you actually do end up with might be more representative of the actual underlying value of what you're holding at the moment. So it's a more sort of pure sense of what you have in terms of worth, as opposed to what is advertised in terms of price, which is also a theme that is very inherent in liquidation ratio, in the debt ceiling, and so on and so forth. Not to just see price as, oh, that's what I'm going to get for it, because you really don't know. Let's see what else I've got. So that basically is the price feed risk. What is the issue that comes from the fragmentation of the market? How do we basically resolve a consistent representation of price so that we can understand the collateral value, so that we can actually see that when the prices fluctuate and CDPs get bitten, that price does actually represent something realistic that the collateral purchasers can rely on and actually go into the market and sell off as. To a certain extent that it isn't, and it benefits the collateral purchasers, they may make a further arbitrage, which will hopefully add towards the the robustness of that particular collateral type, and therefore its price as well. So after that, I want to give it a bit of a pause.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, and hopefully somebody in the chat will jump in with some more, so I don't dominate the discussion. But it was interesting what you said at the very outset about how traditionally in most countries there's a central market where price discovery happens, and I'm wondering whether is it so monopolized because it's such a difficult task to acquire enough liquidity or enough data to set a rational price on things, or are there other market forces at work to sort of centralize the exchanges?
Exchanges are first and foremost a function of regulation.
I see.
It's a form of control. There is so much influence and power that you can garner from an exchange that you need to be, very well regulated. There are, very specific procedures, very specific compliance, very specific reporting that you need to actually be able to do. So consequently, the barriers to entry are actually quite high. Consequently, the cost is pretty big. So to be able to act as an exchange in many countries, you have to get a very purposeful license, and to make sure that you're not competing against an exchange that is considered as a public good, is also more of a political thing. So generally, one exchange pops up in most countries, and that exchange, to a certain extent, looks after the majority of the liquidity for the the equity markets. You can have a bond exchange that is separate. You can have a derivative exchange that is separate to that. But essentially, the primary capital market is your equity exchange, is your stock market, and that is a very well regulated and a very well funded and highly capitalized entity.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I think that there's also a significant amount of risk of a smaller economic market having a poorly regulated exchange could potentially destabilize the country, right?
The thing which explains the crypto markets. If you have a look at setting up a stock exchange in a specific country, and you have a look at setting up an exchange in the crypto world, there really are no barriers to entry. Anyone that can will. Where in the traditional space, even if you can start an exchange, doesn't mean you will. There's just it's highly improbable.
So yeah, possibly the explosion of crypto exchanges that we've seen as a result of that kind of pressure in the real world releasing itself through crypto. Well, so I might be asking some specifics that you don't have the answer to, and maybe Nick, if you're still listening, you can chime in. So I'm wondering, with Ether or Bitcoin or another common cryptocurrency, we have a wide range of exchanges that support those, and potentially we can get somewhat trust. I guess it's up to the risk teams to determine what trustworthy is, but a somewhat trustworthy price discovery. But for lesser known or newer assets that aren't widely traded across multiple exchanges, or maybe are traded on some shadier exchanges, how is there a weighting or a trust value that's applied to the price discovery? Like, what's the barrier to entry for us to determine whether a price is accurate or not? Did I make sense there?
You want me to answer it, or you want to have Nick answer it?
I don't know. Nick, are you still there?
Yeah.
I think that I need somebody to help me stop being so suspicious when it comes to exchanges and the numbers that they present, and the risks of wash trading and front running and all the rest of the foolishness that happens on an exchange. What do we do to determine whether an exchange's numbers are accurate, and what's sort of like the lower bound for?
Oh, that's a different question. I mean, if you're talking about oracles specifically, and actually the construct around oracles, then yeah, Nick's the man. But if you're talking about trying to compensate for wash trading and compensate for real prices versus the value that you really want to see in a collateral type, that's a completely different question. The one thing that you try to do, and the one thing I try to do, is create a proxy. It's actually a very simple proxy. I have a look at the traded volume versus the issued capital or the issued tokens, and if you literally just take the distribution of that metric, you'll find that certain tokens on certain exchanges are extraordinarily high, and that is either something specific to the token itself in terms of its characteristic and its use, but it could also be due to the fact that there is inherent wash trading. And it's not the perfect filter, but it's a starting filter to be able to say, okay, something odd is happening here. Is it something that can be characterized by the type of token it is? And if not, then it's possible that it's wash trading. And then the way that you have to adjust for that is by, effectively dropping down the rating that you give the token. Now, from the qualitative assessment point of view, we come out with a number for a particular token. And that number will have in it the exchanges where you can find that token. And if you find that those exchanges have disproportionately high trading volume in comparison to its own tokens issued, then there'll be a penalty against it. It might be an undeserved penalty. We may get it wrong because it is a characteristic of the token that we're not aware of, but that will definitely come out in the wash, so to say, excuse the pun. But the point here is that you got to start with some metric, you got to start with some device to say, well, what is perceived as a real price reflection versus something that isn't. So your suspicion about exchanges, I think, is valid. And that also speaks to the qualitative assessment of the token as well. You got to know, is that token and the organization representing that token fundamentally a sound business? Because ultimately, wherever it's traded, you might find it have a bit of a wash trading component. It may be completely separate to them. It may have nothing to do with them. And you've got to be able to make that distinction. So you're not penalizing a good organization for bad behavior taking place somewhere else.
So that ties back to, I think that you said in the last meeting that there's, maybe I'm reducing this too much, but the qualitative assessment is key. The liquidity of the market of the token is key, and ultimately an accurate price discovery. So there has to be a trustworthy oracle, and without these three components, then it's not a viable asset class. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's correct. Okay. That is absolutely correct. So this is where Nick will come in with respect to where do we get the oracles from for a specific collateral type? How many oracles are there? How do you include them into our security mechanism? How do we enforce the security mechanism? What does it look like? What are the processes? What happens if you want a new one? How does it, how do we integrate that? I mean, that really is more in Nick's purview, I would think. Yeah, Nick's purview is massive. Believe me, Nick knows a lot. That's just one aspect.
Yeah, now that you mention it, it kind of feels like a topic for a complete call, so we can actually get into some of the nuances there. There's a lot to think about.
I mean, not until I'm done with them. Let me execute first.
Well, you can make promises now. It's no problem, and then we'll hold you to it.
Yeah, we're just trying to corner you so that you come back and explain it all to us.
All right. Speaking of coming back and explaining things, we have 5 minutes left in the meeting, and I think
sure.
I know that I have a hard stop at 10. So, last chance for questions. I'd really love for anybody. No question is too simple, even if it's off topic. If anyone has a question, please type it in the chat. While we're waiting, Stephen, did you have any final points that you wanted to make before the end of the meeting, or anything that you wanted to reinforce?
From my side, I mean, if you just consider the fact that we went over just the liquidation ratio, the concentration risk, and the price feed risk, that is, what we looked at today. But in the next exciting episode, we're going to have a look at economic capital and the stability fee. Where does this stability fee, come from? How is it used as a policy tool? What's the contributing factor of it being a policy tool? And ultimately, let's have a look at economic capital, because that is the amount that the MKDAO token holders are effectively on hook for. So a lot of the how can I say, the criticism for the system is not having this sort of well-defined idea of what the ultimate reserve is that is going to look after the system, where economic capital, which is a calculation which is also called expected shortfall, gives us a very good indication of what that is. So as we bring in collateral types, we have more of an understanding about how much MKR token holders are on the hook for if something goes terribly wrong.
That's been a common complaint or criticism when we read about people evaluating, at least the good evaluations of the MakerDAO ecosystem, is that there's no central lever. That people seem to be, there seems to be a human desire to find like, oh, this is the one thing that makes MakerDAO stable. And I'm wondering if you think that that's a valid criticism, because when I look at the system from my sort of armchair economist perspective, I am impressed by the series of competing and conflicting incentives that create this homeostasis. But in a lot of our criticisms online, it's because there isn't this one thing, this one overarching thing that makes stability happen. Do you think that that's a valid complaint? Is this an economic principle that I'm unaware of, that there should be one thing
No.
sort of governing a system?
No, basically you have the construct is defined by a set of governing dynamics. And then what you find is that you may have one or two buttons that may change just one part of that governing dynamic structure. And as a consequence, it slowly changes the way the governing dynamics interact with each other. And then you push the other button, and you can turn that system back to what it was beforehand, or even change it slightly to look differently. So you've got these two buttons, which are effectively your levers. In our case, it could be the risk parameters, which is, for all intents and purposes, 3 buttons. And the way that you push those will generally help you figure out what those governing dynamics will do in the background. So the idea of equilibrium, or the idea of balance, is extraordinarily dynamic. You can't go in and stick your hand into this moving machine and grab a mechanism and then change it. You actually have to influence it from the sides, and then that mechanism might change slightly and find the new equilibrium or the new balance. So the criticism of, for instance, like not having a well-defined reserve is just tantamount to saying, well, from this perspective, you would need this in order to do this. And what we're saying is that it is actually inherently baked in the system. Thank you for your criticism, though.
Okay, that's great. That gave me another idea. It might be interesting at some point in the future to maybe come up with a top 10 list of the various criticisms that we've seen, or various critiques.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Take a real,
no,
absolutely, and we can basically deal with that. And I assure you that there are some, very specific governing elements that I am not going to be able to articulate down to the first principles. But I can go and ask our good friend Lev to include himself, because he sure as heck will.
Yeah, he's pull out the big guns.
Yeah, he'll pull out the nukes to make sure that we solve that problem.
All right, we have 1 minute left, and I think that and here comes the questions. I don't know. What are some of the existential threats for Maker? What can lead to the entire project failing? From Andrew Bourbon. So that's a tough one. So I think the question here is, what are the black swans? By the very nature of the definition, we don't know what they are. But if you had to guess, what do you think? Well,
there's outright stupidity, where, let's say, for instance, we decide that single collateral DAI ETH debt ceiling is 3 billion, and then we put the liquidation ratio down to like 110%, and as a consequence, for some reason, through volatility, 70% of the CDPs get liquidated. MKR is going to be on hook for a heck of a lot. And that will basically end everything. So a global settlement will probably be more sufficient there, or an emergency shutdown. Another one is just, the landscape. I mean, it's ultimately, the grounding beneath us is called the Ethereum blockchain. And if for some reason Ethereum blockchain ends, we end. I mean, we can transfer across to a new rendition of whatever the blockchain is, but for all intents and purposes, as far as the state is concerned, the state of matters will basically come to a grinding halt if Ethereum as a blockchain goes away.
Potentially crypto apathy is another one. It could be that we all just had a massive delusion and crypto just is not going to take off in the next 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, well, basically that sort of that delusion will then just make sure that it'll wind down the Ethereum framework, which ultimately will wind down us as well.
Yeah, Jordan has an interesting point as well. I think that, and this is there's a debate to be had here, but governance, and I think that Stephen, that's kind of what you were implying when you said stupidity earlier. is that yeah, poor governance. We could just make bad decisions, but I think that at the same time, and at least in my opinion, governance is one of the ways that we save ourselves from a black swan. Because it's,
I mean, there's a plutocratic problem with governance, but there's also a case of saying, well, if we can, devise our arguments through some sort of rigor, we may actually avoid the influence of plutocracy.
Yeah, it's a very complex one. Actually, I'm going to, Andrew and Jordan, I'm going to add your questions to our text file, and we'll go address them at the next meeting, because I seriously need to jump out right now.
Okay, cool.
All right, thanks everybody for joining. This is a great meeting. I think this is worthy of a Reddit post. So once it's on YouTube, I'll post it to our subreddit so people can have a look.
Thank you, folks, for joining. I do appreciate it, and thank you for your questions.
All right, thanks everybody.
All right, later, guys.